The button system in automatic CSS is insanely powerful, well beyond what any other framework or page builder provides. And we're going to take a look at all of the intricacies of the button system in this video. You might think, oh, Kevin, it's just buttons. You know, what could there be to talk about? There's actually a lot to talk about. There's actually a lot to talk about when it comes to buttons, especially if you want to do anything beyond the basics. Okay, so we're going to cover everything in this video, and I think you're also going to find, you're going to be pleasantly surprised that managing buttons, given the power of this system, is actually very easy also. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The first thing I think we need to talk about, just from a prerequisite standpoint, so everybody is on the same page, is the difference between buttons and links in web design. I see a lot of confusion in this area. Now, as far as styling goes, it actually doesn't matter, but I do want you to know the technicalities of buttons versus links. So what I've done here is I've added a button element in bricks. I've added a text link in bricks, and I've added a text element where I changed the HTML tag to button. And I want to go ahead and save. I want to look at this on the front end with you. We'll just do a little quick inspection and see what's actually going on here. Notice that the first one, this is the button element in bricks, is actually not a button. It is a link. Okay, the A is for link. Notice the text link below it is also an A, also a link. And notice the third thing is an actual button. Okay, so the first two are links, and even though it looks like a button, it's a link. Okay, the third one is actually a button. Notice that when I make something a button, by the way, the browser determines that, oh, that should have like a light gray background, and like the browser adds some default styling to it. And then on the text link, of course, it looks like a link, but this thing up here that was called a button in the page builder is actually not a button, it's a link. It just visually looks like a button. What is the difference? This is what everybody's confused on. Links, it's very simple. Links are navigational elements. They take the user from the page they're on to a different page. If that's going to be happening, you probably want to choose a link, okay? Even if it's going to look like a button, it's actually semantically a link. Now, what about this third thing down here, the actual button element? That is for triggering on-page events. For example, you want to fire off a modal. Well, you don't use a link for that, okay? Like a lot of people would add this button element and use that. That's actually incorrect because you're using a navigational element to open a modal. That's technically wrong, okay? So in that case, you would want to use a button element. Just like if you were firing off a form submission. So we have a form, the submit button is a literal button. It is doing an action on this page. It is not navigating the user to somewhere else. So in that case, again, you would use a button element. So button elements are for firing off interactivity on the page that the user is on, whereas links, even if those buttons, or even if those links look like buttons, links are navigational. They take the user to a different URL. I'm sorry, my watch is going absolutely crazy right now. Okay, so that's the discrepancy between buttons versus links, just to clear that up. But from a styling standpoint, especially when using automatic CSS, it actually doesn't matter at all. So we're going to talk about how to apply button styles. By default, and in most cases, you want to use your website's primary button style, which very often is mapped to the website's primary color. And so I have the same button, link, and real button here, okay? It's really link, button. And I'm gonna apply the styles. How do we do that? Well, we just use a utility class. So we're gonna come up here and write button, BTN, double dash, and then we're gonna call the style of button that we want. In this case, we're gonna say primary. So I'm gonna say button primary, and it is gonna completely change. And now automatic CSS has taken over. Bricks is no longer involved in the style of this button. Everything goes through automatic CSS now, okay? I'm going to do the same thing with this link, which by the way is like red text. It's not, doesn't even look like it has a box. Like how can this thing possibly turn into a button? Don't worry about it. Just go button primary and you're going to see that it becomes a button. Okay. And then what about this button? I mean, it's an HTML button. It's not even a link and it's got a gray background. It's got a lot of stuff. What do we do here? Well, again, you don't have to worry. You just have to say button primary. And whenever you say button primary, you're going to get button primary. So these three all look exactly the same by using one simple utility class. Okay, now let's scroll down. What about variants? Again, one of the only frameworks or builder experiences where we've actually thought ahead to a situation where, well, what if the user has a background on this section that is their primary color? And isn't that going to collide with the button primary style? So I add button primary to the button, and yeah, it actually does. The button, you can't even see it. It disappears, okay? You can only see the text for the button. That's not a great experience, okay? So what can we do in this regard? Well, you could use a black button. You could use a white button, which we have available to us. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But for the purposes of consistent theming, a lot of designers don't want to do that. A lot of designers want to just use the primary button, but like a lighter variant of it, or a darker variant of the primary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say button double dash. And instead of saying primary, I'm going to call the primary light version. So we have a light variant, and then we also have a dark variant. So I'm going to say primary dark, and there's the dark variant. All right, so we have a main button, that's button primary. We have a light variant, that's primary light. And we have a dark variant, that's primary dark. And so now it doesn't matter what the situation is. You have a button that is going to fit the context of whatever you're trying to do. And it's going to stay on theme. Okay. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Kevin, can you customize all of this? Or is it just out of the box? Don't worry. We're going to get there. I understand your concern. We're going to get there. Remember when I said this is the most powerful and flexible button system available? We're going to get there. Okay. That's why we're doing this video. But before we get there, we need to talk about another kind of variant, right? We already saw a light variant and a dark variant. Well, we also have an outline variant. So I'm going to grab this button right here. And the rule for this is there's no like primary outline, okay? Like this. There's just the button style that you want, primary light, primary dark, or it could be secondary, or it could be tertiary, or it could be, all of the colors are available to you. It depends on what you turn on. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. But in this case, I'm just going to say button primary, and then I stack another class next to that. And that class is simply button outline. Just give me the outline variant. And those two classes combined are going to work the magic. So you get the primary style, but in the outline variant, okay? All right, great. Now, you might be thinking, well, Kevin, what about the light and the dark? Do those work with outline as well? Yeah, absolutely. So if I come up here and I say button outline, guess what we're going to get? We're going to get the dark version, but the outline variant, okay? And then the same thing would be for primary light as well. So you have multiple different variants to choose from. Now, a lot of people might say, Kevin, hold on. My design, my website is not, I don't want to do button outline there. I want to do button primary, okay? My website only uses outline buttons. I actually don't want any solid buttons. And so for efficiency purposes, could I just make it so that when I say button primary, it actually gives me the outline variant? Like that would speed up my workflow tremendously. Yes, we can do that, okay? So what we're gonna do for the first time, we're gonna open the ACSS dashboard. All right, I'm gonna close this sidebar over here just to simplify things a little bit. And I'm gonna go to buttons and links. And this is where all of the magic happens for the button system in Automatic CSS. And let's just see what our options are right off the bat. So we have global, which says all buttons. We have primary, and we have neutral. Now, if I go over here to color palette, we're going to see why those are our options. I'm using the primary color and I'm using the neutral color. Now, if I turn on secondary and I go back to buttons and links, suddenly you're going to see that I have controls for the secondary button style, okay? Because that is mapped to my secondary color. So that's fantastic, right? On this website, we're not using secondary, so we don't need to worry about that. But that's how, like, depending on the colors that you have enabled is what you will see here for button set options. All right, just so you understand how that logic works, okay? Now, I have primary. I'm going to open that, and we're going to see, look at this. I have controls for the solid variant, controls for the dark variant, controls for the light variant, the outline variant, the dark outline variant, and the light outline variant. Now, before we make the solid button outline by default and answer that question, let's just talk about the fact that People might find this overwhelming. And you might say, Kevin, my site's not that complicated. Like, I just have a solid button style. That's all I have. My guy, like, I don't want to deal with all this stuff, right? This is too much. It's too much. No problem. It's no problem, okay? We're going to head over to the options area. We're going to open primary, and we're going to see right here, primary buttons, light dark variants, and outline variants. So once again, we're going to say, well, you know what? I'm going to make outline the default. Okay, so let's turn off outline variants. I don't need that. I'm going to make that the default. And then I don't need light and dark variants. Okay, I'm going to keep this website very, very, very simple. So I've turned off light and dark variants, and I've turned off outline variants. And now what I'm going to do is come over here to buttons, primary, and look at this. Look at this. Very, very simple now. Okay, I only have the exact controls that I want for the project that I am working on. And now we're going to talk about how we can make this. How can we possibly make this, these solid primary buttons, how can we make them outline by default? Well, I'm going to say background, and I'm going to say transparent, okay? And you can see we're actually very close. We're almost there. What else do I need to change? Well, I need to change the text color. So the text color is right here. Instead of primary ultra light, I'm going to say, why don't we just use primary for that? And guys, I pretty much have an outline version by default. Okay. So anytime, and I'll go ahead and prove this to you. So let's save here. Let's save here. I'm going to go ahead and just add a button primary, okay? In fact, right here is a button sitting here, okay? No classes on it, nothing's been added. So I'm just gonna say button primary, and I'm gonna hit enter, and I get the outline variant, okay? So if you're dealing with a website where it's all outlines, you're not gonna use any solid colored buttons, this is probably the most efficient approach, which, by the way, if the design ever changes, what if the client comes along? What if the client comes along and they're like, I don't know if I like the outlines. I want solid buttons. You know, I gave it a little while, but my brain can't get past it. I really want solid buttons on my website. Well, you're in a situation where you didn't use an outline utility class for every single outline, like to make all these buttons outline buttons. You made that the default. And if they wanted to go back to solid, watch this. Reset, reset. They're all solid now. You just hit save and you move on with your life. It's absolutely fantastic, right? So for efficiency purposes, if everything needs to be an outline, that's probably the best way to go. It's just make them outlined by default using the controls at your disposal. Okay, now let's talk about black, white, and neutral buttons, because you're gonna notice there's neutral, but there's no black, there's no white. There used to be black and white. Like if we head over to the deprecated tab and we go to deprecated buttons, hey, look, there used to be black and white, but that wasn't flexible enough because black can only ever be black and white can only ever be white. We wanted something that is more flexible. So what we have is a neutral button set, which again, has solid, has dark, has light, has outline, dark outline, light outline, all available to you. You can manage this from the neutral buttons dashboard, what is available or not available, okay? Like I can get rid of the outline variants if I want to, and then I'm gonna head back over to neutral and I have solid, dark, and light. And this gives me the ability to have black, gives me the ability to have white, gives me the ability to have charcoals, okay? Or light grays, dark grays, whatever I wanna do. And so what is the best way to handle this? Well, by default, okay, it uses neutral, which is black, and then neutral ultra light. So if I did, let's actually add a button here. So let's duplicate this and let's change this one from neutral dark to just neutral. So button neutral, neutral, okay? So it's black. So button neutral is black by default. Button neutral light is neutral ultra light, which we could just make white if we wanted to be pure white, okay? This is very, very easy to manage this stuff. Neutral is black, so that's fine. Neutral ultra light for the border color. No, we wanna do white for the border color. And then you have your focus style, which you can choose in here as well. We'll talk more about focus styles in just a minute. So that's one way to do it. Now you could also say, well, I have a gray button in my design, and then I have a black button and a white button. So you could make the gray neutral, and you could make the black neutral dark, and you could make the white neutral light. This is completely up to you, how you manage this section. What you have to understand is that using the light and dark variants, you have grays covered, black covered and white covered. And all you're going to do is use these little simple inputs. There's 4 inputs per variant to determine what the actual styles map to, okay? And just to explain really quickly, this little arrow right here is for managing the hover version of that thing. So for example, under primary, here's background set to primary. If I click this arrow, it's showing me primary hover is my hover shade, okay? But I could say black. You can make this whatever you want. And now when I hover primary buttons, wherever they are, I get a black background, okay? Let's go these, all right, see that? Now notice the problem. The border color is still primary on hover, okay? So if I go border color, click the arrow, change this to black as well, okay? Let's do black. Now when I hover, the border is black on hover as well. And look how easy that is, just a little flip of the switch between the normal state and the hover state. Very, very, very simple. The one thing you need to know is that clearing this style is only clearing the hover style. It's not going to clear your main style, okay? So I'm going to clear that hover style. And so now we're back to normal button behavior. I just wanted to show you that a lot of people are like, what is that arrow for? That's what that arrow is for. It's for managing the hover state. And that's on any input in the dashboard. Anytime you see that little arrow, that is for managing a hover state of that property. Okay. So let's scroll down. We talked about black, white, and neutral. Now let's talk about the global styling versus the button set styling. So far, we've been managing the styles of button sets. I showed you how to change like the background color, the text color, the border color, focus color, all that good stuff, right? But what about like the padding? What about the border radius? What about the border thickness? Where are the controls for all of that? Well, those controls live under global. Why? Because even though you have different button sets, like a primary, a black, a white, a gray, or whatever, you don't want the padding values to be all different. You don't want all your buttons to be all whacked out, and you don't want them to have to manage those independently. Like, I set the padding on my primary button. Now I got to go set the black button and the white button and the secondary button. Those got to have all the same values. And then what? You're going to manage those manually. So when they change in one place, you got to go change. No. Buttons have a global style. They have shared properties. There's a lot of shared properties. And then to make the button look different, typically we're just changing the background color, the text color, the hover state, the border color, whatever. But we want the shared styles to be shared styles across all of our buttons. So all of our buttons look very, very consistent, right? And that's what this global button styling area is for, okay? So for example, minimum button width. I say minimum my button can be is 300 pixels. Well, guess what? They're all 300 pixels now. Now, what about these that don't have classes on them? Well, those aren't going to be affected because they're not influenced by automatic CSS because we have not put any classes on them yet. Only buttons that have button classes will be affected, okay? I could say 100 pixels. I could take off the minimum, which means that however much text is in that button, that's how big the button is going to be. But remember, this is 0, right? So see how that one got smaller? It'll never be too small because it's whatever the text is. And like I put it at 0, these are obviously like, it's not going to cause any problems to be at 0. But a lot of people are like, if you have a button with one little word, it's like, it doesn't really look great. Like it doesn't look like a button anymore. It's too small. So you can set a minimum button width. But the point here is in this dashboard, these controls affect every button. It doesn't matter what color they are, what set they're from. It affects all buttons. For example, let's say I want all my buttons to be bold. Now all my buttons are bold. What if I want all of my buttons to be uppercase? Now all of my buttons are uppercase. What if I want the letter spacing to be -2 pixels? Okay. Let's do -2 pixels. Look, it's all squished text. I can do -1 pixel like that. Text decoration, we can do, why would I want to do this? I don't know, that looks terrible, but you can underline the text in your buttons. So this affects the global style. I'm going to reset all of that so that we don't have crazy looking buttons. And then our border radius is using our radius system, which we're going to do a video on, okay? But you can make this whatever you want. 5 pixels, 25 pixels, 50 VW, whatever you want to make it, but it is radius by default so that it matches your image radius and your card radius and all that other stuff, right? Part of the radius system. And then we have a global transition style that controls how the hover states transition We're going to do a video on ACSS's global transition style. But again, you could turn this off and put your own transition value in. So if you turn that off, it's going to give you an input that will accept any valid transition instructions that you want to provide. Or you can just say, no, I want this to use my website's global transition style, which is set in a different area. And we're going to do a different video on that. But buttons use that by default. Okay. So that is the global button styles versus the styles for independent button sets. And now we get on to the next thing, which is, Kevin, okay, but these are very boring looking buttons. Like I personally want a gradient button. Okay. They want these fancy buttons. They want to use a background image in their buttons. They want like, and really, you know, ACSS, it's just a framework, like, you know, it's so limiting, right? Have you heard this? It's so limiting at what you're able, like, you know, if you need anything beyond the basics, it's not going to work for you. Oh, really? It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go make a little gradient button here. We're not even going to use custom CSS for this. We're going to use the automatic CSS dashboard. So let's say instead of a solid, my primary color buttons, I want these to be a gradient. So one thing you need to know is this background is not a background color input. It is a background input. That means it will accept any valid background statement, which means you could use a background image. You could use a gradient. You could do anything you want to do right here. Okay, so I'll show you. Linear gradient, and then I'm going to use parentheses, and let's say it's going to be 180 degrees, and then I'm going to use shades from my system. We'll use primary and primary light. Okay. Now, the only thing you need to know is we don't use vars. Okay. So you just use dash primary, comma, primary light, and I now have a gradient button. Now notice that gradients don't look good when there's a border. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to go up to global all buttons, come down to button border styles, border width, 0 pixels. And now your gradient buttons no longer have a border, and it looks like a true gradient button. Okay. Now let's go back to primary, and let's say, all right, that primary light was a little too light. Let's do primary semi-light. There we go. Now that's a much better, softer, nicer gradient. Fantastic. But look what it does. It goes solid on hover. I don't really want it to go solid on hover. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go hover style. I'm going to paste this in, and maybe we want this to be, this goes to primary hover, and this goes to primary, just primary. How about that? I don't even know how that's going to look, but look at that hover. Okay. Perfect. So gradient buttons, I can do it. Again, if you want to use a background image, you can do it. If you want to use multiple background statements in the background, you can do that. Anything that is valid, you can do right here in the dashboard for both the main state and the hover state as well. Okay, so that covers your gradient button functionality. Let's go ahead and reset that. So let's reset, and let's reset the hover style as well. So we're back to where we were with our normal buttons. We also need to reset the button border width back to the default of 2 pixels, and we're good to go. Now we run into a situation again. Oh, but yeah, it's just a framework. I mean, you know, what if you have third-party buttons? I mean, you're screwed then, aren't you? Like right here, we have a facet from WP Grid Builder. What are we going to do there? Because it's giving us this blue button with a different font, a different everything going on. I actually want this facet to look like a thing. And I can't put a class on that facet. It's actually, if I was going to put a class on there like button primary, it would be putting it on the facet's wrapper. Okay. So I actually don't physically have access to put a class on that facet for button primary to make it look like a primary button. So what on earth are we going to be able to do? Well, let's go ahead first of all, and let's take a trip to the front end, and I want to refresh, and I want to go down to that facet. Now, again, this is a little, this part of it is a little bit dependent on your skill set, but that's why I'm teaching you, okay? You have to know how to inspect an element because it's a third-party element. We have to go figure out what the heck did they do. Like, you know, everybody does everything differently. So the only way for us to find out is to right click it and hit inspect and see what they're doing. Now I'm going to close the ACSS dashboard for a second to make this even easier. we're going to click on button right here. This is the button. And notice it has this class, WPGB-button. It's got another class, WPGB-load-more. Okay. And if I hover right here, I can see a bunch of these styles are coming from this string right here. And then there's more styles like the background color actually coming from this instruction over here. So two different selectors going on to style this button. And if I hover over here, you're going to see a little specificity indicator come up, and it's going to say 020. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but CSS is a game of specificity. And I actually hate that, a lot of third-party developers use too much specificity to do this default styling, making our job a little bit harder than it needs to be. If I go up to this property right here, this selector, and hover 021, right? So in order for us to style this button, number one, we have to have a way to do it. Automatic CSS gives you a way to do it. Hint, hint, okay? Step number two, we just have to make sure when we do it, we override the specificity. We use more specificity. So I'm going to show you a little trick for this, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this button, and you see this button, WPGB button thing? I'm just going to steal that, okay? So I'm going to highlight it, copy, and it's on my clipboard. I'm going to steal that, okay? We're going to override it. Now, what we're going to do is go back to home, global CSS, which is actually SAS, okay? That's going to come in handy here. I'm going to paste the selector, okay? So I'll right click and I'll hit paste. So there's the selector right here. Now that selector by itself is not going to work because it doesn't have enough specificity. We need to add specificity. There's a trick to adding specificity without changing the actual selector. I'm going to show it to you right now. So we're going to take this part of it, the WPGB button, and we're going to paste it 2 more times. So paste and paste, okay? Now, I can do something. Now that looks really weird. You're like, what on earth is going on? It's just a trick to increase specificity. Why are we doing it? Because they used too much specificity when they did their thing. So we have to use extra. So we have to do dumb stuff like this. That's not our fault. That's their fault, okay? They use too much specificity in their default. So we have to do stuff like this. It's like a little game that we have to play, a little battle of specificity, if you will. But now, the magic from Automatic CSS. Automatic CSS has these things called Mixins, which are SAS recipes. And in one line, I can essentially just do a lot of things all at once, okay? So the way you do a mixin is you write @include, okay? That's how you call a mixin, right? I want to include these styles right here. What styles? Well, button styles, BTN. And then I do parentheses. And in the parentheses, I tell it what styles I want to include. Well, I want to use my primary button style, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and hit save here. So one line, all we did is we stole a selector from the third-party thing, this facet, right? And then in one line, we might have to refresh this or even go to the front end. Let's see. Or maybe we didn't even use enough specificity yet. So let's go down. There we go. I just had to refresh the builder. Okay. One line, I stole the selector that they were using. I added specificity because I needed to because of what they did. And then with one line with Automatic CSS, this now looks like all of my other buttons. Let's go to the front end and refresh and see what this looks like, okay? So I scroll down. So here's my primary button style here, primary button style here. Look at this. The facet is now my primary button style. Now the facet's gone because it did its job, right? One line. Let's go ahead and review exactly what we just did there, okay? So let's bring Automatic CSS back up. Include button primary. So basically you're calling all the primary button styles into this selector right here, and we get the effect that we wanted, which is that third-party thing that we couldn't even put a class on now looks like all of our other buttons. And check this out. Check this out. The beauty of this is that I've hijacked the facet. I can actually control the facet from the Automatic CSS dashboard now. Let's do 3M on there. Now these are very ugly looking buttons, but I'm just showing you the point here. Anything that I do, I am able to completely control that facet now from the Automatic CSS dashboard. Why? Because I hooked it in to the Automatic CSS button system. And again, to review, with one line, include button primary. Now you're like, Kevin, what if I wanted that to be the outline variant? What would I do? So I'm gonna highlight that. The only difference is I need to put this in quotes because now what I need to do is add the button outline class to that name primary. And I'm gonna go ahead and hit save. And then we're gonna refresh and we're gonna see what happens, okay? So let's let this reload. Good. Refresh the builder as well. A lot of times you need a hard refresh more than the just the hot reload. And we're going to come down and, oh, look at this, the outline version. But guys, that's not primary. What is going on? Well, here's where you have to remember on your website what you're actually doing. I'm going to go to buttons and links, options, primary. Look at this. I don't have the outline variant turned on. So we're not loading code for the outline variant, which means if I try to call an outline variant, it's not going to work. I've got to activate outline variants. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And then when we refresh, you will see that that is in fact a primary outline button. Okay, we got to refresh the builder again. The rendering in the builder takes an actual refresh most of the time, especially for third-party elements like this. But look at this. It's the outline version. Okay, I'll refresh on the front end just to check it out here as well. And I'm going to scroll down. And we're going to see, there you go. So the facet is now the outline variant. And if I go up here to buttons and links and I go to primary and I go to outline, look at this. Do I have actual control over that facet now? Let's change primary to black. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. So the text color is black. Now, the only difference is now, because it's a third party element, you're not always going to see the, live preview of things, okay? But I come down and now the text is actually black, okay? So I have, in fact, completely hijacked that third-party element and I can control it with automatic CSS, but I might lose certain capabilities like live preview and things like that. So always check with a hard refresh on the front end to see if what you did is actually doing its job, because the hot reload, the live preview, those things may not work with third-party elements, but they're still actually working on the front end, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let's clear all of this out. Let's go back to buttons and links. Global styles is fine. Primary, let's clear that out as well. Save. Okay, so last but not least, what if we just want a completely custom button, okay? Well, let's take a look at how easy this is. So I'm gonna get off the front end. I'm gonna go back into the back end. I'm gonna refresh the builder. And we're going to go down and we're going to make a completely custom button. Because once again, guys, remember, this is just a framework, and all these frameworks, I mean, have so many limitations. If you really want to do anything super custom, I mean, it's not going to help you do that. It's going to, in fact, it would stop you from doing that. No. At some point, you'll start believing me that automatic CSS is very, very different. I would not use a framework if it had limitations. If it stopped me from doing what I wanted to do, I would not use it, right? And I'm building it because that's my philosophy. It's built the way that it is because that is my philosophy. There are no limitations with automatic CSS, point blank. So I'm gonna go to this button right here. Now, in fact, when I wanna go rogue, completely custom, automatic CSS still helps you do that, because what we know is, well, I mean, you still want the global styles, right? You still, because you don't want a button that just looks completely different from every, like completely different padding, completely different border radius. I mean, if you do, then that's fine. Just make your own class and do whatever you want to do. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. What I'm saying is, what if you want a completely custom button, but you want it to share the global styles with all the other buttons in the system? Is that possible? Yes. Okay, here's a magic trick. Button, double dash, and then just whatever you want to name it. So I'll say, well, I already did one in my test, completely custom. Let's use something else. Very custom, okay? So button, very custom. All right, I'm gonna hit enter. And right when I hit enter, look what that does. It starts to bring in global styles. Now, there aren't certain things, like it doesn't have any color, right? It doesn't have a background, it doesn't have any of those things, but it does have a bunch of global styles. Let's go and check this out. Remember, this is not part of ACSS. The fact that I started the class with button double dash informs automatic CSS, hey, this needs to share global styles with all of our other buttons, okay? It's a magic trick. It's just, there's nothing you need to do to make that happen. If you don't want that to happen, then don't use button double dash. Use button single dash, okay? Or just say button, or say custom button. Like, name whatever you want to do, but if you use button double dash syntax, it's going to inherit the global button styles, okay? Let's put very custom back on here and just show you buttons and links, global all buttons. Let's change this to 5M. Look, I'm in control of that button out of the box. I don't have to do anything else. Don't have to add any custom CSS, no Sass mix-ins, no nothing. It just works because I used the syntax, okay? Now, what about the actual styling, okay? Well, we have something called a recipe, all right? A recipe is like a mix-in, but it works in vanilla CSS, and it gives you the actual underlying code so that you can adjust it. All right, so what I'm gonna do is write at btn, and then I'm gonna put a semicolon. And the minute I put a semicolon in, it's going to expand out, and that's what a recipe does in automatic CSS. Now, I don't have to keep it like this, right? This is where I can start customizing my very custom button, right? So for example, button background, I'm going to take out the primary, and I'm going to say linear gradient. And this is where I can say, 55 degrees, and then I can put my primary, I can put my var primary semi-light in there, and now I've got a gradient button at 55 degrees. And if I copy this and paste it for the hover, and I say, all right, this is gonna be primary semi-light here, and this is just gonna be primary, and now my hover actually works as well. And I can just customize to my heart's content, do whatever I wanna do for my very custom button, but at the end of the day, it's gonna share all of the automatic CSS global button styles. So I'm still hooked into the system. I still have global control, but I do have literally whatever I want using even a custom button class, okay? Let me go back to camera. This is the power of the ACSS button system. There are multiple ways to get to the finish line depending on what you need to do, whether you're using standard button classes in ACSS with the ACSS dashboard inputs, or you're styling a third-party element using the Sass mix-in, or you're going completely custom and you're using the button recipe and you're customizing the individual variables. Anything that you need to do is possible with the ACSS button system. If you have any questions about the button system, and by the way, I would just recommend just play around with it. Get a little playground set up, do all the variants, do the customization, test out the Sass mix-in, test out the recipe. Even if you don't see yourself using it right now, familiarize yourself with these things, because when you run into a situation where these things are necessary, it'll trigger in your brain, oh yes, ACSS can do this. Not only can it do it can do it easily, right? One line with a Sass mix-in, one line with a recipe, expanding that recipe out, giving me all these controls with variables. The understanding that background property is not just background color. It can be a linear gradient. It could be a background image. It could be so many things, right? So you've got to play around with it. Get it into your brain. And then when you run into these situations, you'll know exactly what to do. But of course, if you need any help, we are happy to help you in the support community, or you can drop a comment below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment for support. If you're just like, man, this is outlandish, what this allows you to do, I'd love to hear it. Drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.